Some people will say, well, it's obvious that boys are doing these shootings. It's the reason why we don't say it. The reason why we say it's kids killing kids. Everybody knows that boys are the ones doing the vast majority of the violence. You don't need to say it. But the fact is, if you don't say it, then in the subsequent discussion about the causes of the violence, then you're going to leave out one of the key elements. Another example, road rage. People don't typically think of road rage as a gendered phenomenon, but one recent study showed that out of 10,000 cases of aggressive driving or road rage, over 95% were males. But you read the editorials in the newspapers throughout the country about road rage in the articles and essays and opinion columns, and it's rarely talked about as a masculine or male phenomenon. It's just a phenomenon on our roadways. If women were doing it, 95% of the people who were doing it were women, you can bet that it would be the single issue that would be talked about is why are women, what is going on in the gender construction of women that caused them to act in that way. When girls commit violence, that's always the subject. The gendered nature of the crime is always part of the discussion.
A sensational case goes to trial in Virginia tomorrow involving a man who was sexually mutilated by his wife.
Now, Lorena Bobbitt, her crime was brutal, admittedly, and I understand, believe me, as a man, understand why people would be, especially men, would be very uncomfortable about that. But every day, men are murdering and mutilating women, and it doesn't cause as great a national outcry. One of the reasons why the film Thelma and Louise caused such a stir back in the early 90s was that women were the ones who were acting violently.
God. Oh, my God.
Get the car.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Louise, you shot him.
You have films all the time. I mean, go into any video store and walk down the aisles, you know, and look at all the films that feature violence against women, including sexualized violence against women by men. And there's little outcry and little commentary by the movie critics, for example, when they're reviewing these films. They don't talk about the fact that we have this huge epidemic of men assaulting women, and we're making yet another film about an assault against women. Look at the recent remake of Psycho. That was not part of the discussion when Psycho was re-released, that we're yet again going to show a sexualized image of a woman being assaulted, and that's going to be considered great art, and people are going to go see it. Yet Thelma and Louise, you had debates going on in the newspapers of the United States. Is this a bad trend? It was similar to the outcry about Lorena Bobbitt. What's happened is because violence has been gendered masculine, we think it's unusual only when women do it. When men do it, it's so normal that its masculine character is unremarkable. In fact, it's invisible. So one of the things we have to do is to make it visible. Feminist scholars and activists have been trying to do this for years, but they've been largely ignored. Making masculinity visible is the first step to understanding how it operates in the culture and how definitions of manhood have been linked to dominance and control. Many cultural analysts would argue that if you want to understand the meaning of something in society, look at its representation in the media. What stories are being told about it in the popular culture? And if we look at images of men and masculinity over the last 50 years, we see that there have been some dramatic and really interesting changes in what is considered to be masculine, especially in terms of the size of men's bodies. These changes tell us a story about what's going on in the culture. For example, if you compare the Superman of the 1950s to what we now think of as the Man of Steel, you'll see a fairly dramatic difference. If you think about Batman and Adam West as Batman in the 1960s and look at his body and compare it to the Batman of the movies of the 90s, there's a fairly dramatic difference. How about pro wrestling? Pro wrestlers' bodies in the 1960s were more flabby, if you will. If you look at them in the 80s and 90s, they become much bigger and stronger and more rippled. If you look at the Star Wars toy figurines that kids play with in the 1970s and contrast them with the Star Wars toy figurines that are being marketed to kids in the 1990s, you see a dramatic shift. There really is something happening here. Something's going on. Look at the way that the body of G.I. Joe, the doll that millions of boys play with, has changed over the last 20 years. Researchers have calculated that the size of his biceps, in real-life equivalents, has increased from 12.2 inches in 1964 to 15.2 inches in 1974 to 16.4 inches in 1994 and up to 26.8 inches by 1998. If you wanted a comparison to a real person, Mark McGuire's biceps are only 20 inches. As I said, something is really going on. One of the interesting things is that if you compare this with the image of the female body, you'll see the reverse thing happening. Whereas full-figured women such as Marilyn Monroe or Jane Mansfield were the representation of ideal female beauty in the 1950s, by the 80s and 90s, the ideal had become much thinner, more waifish, more girlish. One of the ways to explain these shifts is that in an era when women have been challenging male power in business, the professions, education, and other areas of economic and social life, the images of women that have flooded the culture show women as less threatening. They're literally taking up less symbolic space. At the same time, images of men have gotten bigger, stronger, more muscular, and more violent. In other words, one of the ways that men have responded to women's challenges is by overcompensating and placing greater value on size, strength, and muscularity. And in terms of media images, this means big, beefy men have been taking up even more symbolic space. It's really important to remember that there's nothing natural about images. They don't just come about by accident. They're made by someone, and mostly in our culture, it's been men that have been in charge when it comes to being the authors and creators of popular culture. So if these images are changing, they're reflecting what's going on in the psyches of these men. Actually, what we're seeing, in part, is their pathologies or anxieties being played out on the screen. But this isn't just happening inside the heads of some advertising gurus or Hollywood screenwriters. There's a historical context for all of this. The civil rights movement had started in the 1950s and 60s to challenge the deeply entrenched system of white supremacy. The women's liberation movement had catalyzed serious challenges to male power, winning court battles and making headlines all over the country in the 1960s and 70s. The gay and lesbian movements had been challenging and disrupting heterosexual power and privilege since the early 1970s. And the anti-war and student movements that opposed U.S. intervention in Vietnam had disrupted the plans of political elites, especially as the U.S. suffered what many people regarded as its first ever military defeat. All of these social movements that were taking place around the same time were a really serious challenge to the dominant white heterosexual masculinity that held social, political, economic, and cultural power in the United States. Take the modern multicultural women's movement, for example, which is one of the most important social movements in history. This movement has given us a new way to think about gender relations and sexual relationships and identities, and as a result, many men in society have experimented with new personal styles as well as new attitudes and approaches towards things like relationships, work, parenting, and many other areas. And as a result, there are many young men today who are living lives that are very different from our fathers and grandfathers, and who have incorporated these changes and who are thinking in a much more egalitarian way about relations between men and women, about sexual equality in the workplace, and a whole bunch of other areas of social life.
So one of the reasons we have this tough guy image to live up to is the Western European patriarchy during colonialism taking over the world. Not only are they superior, but they have the right. In fact, they have the responsibility to go take others' land, to enslave them, and to use the resources to build their own personal wealth. This is what the market is founded on. This is what's going on in the world today. And that's why we see Black Lives Matter, Me Too movement. We see the problem with immigration, the violence and the brutality towards immigration. This is the Western European patriarchy maintaining its global superiority as it's falling and failing. But that's one of the things, the major thing, that then affects the creation of the masculine and the creation of the feminine and the violence of the masculine. Okay, let's look at gender roles. They're culturally created. We've talked about that. There are three general types that anthropologists have classified. Three patterns of division of labor by gender. Flexible integrated pattern. This is where 35% of the tasks are performed equally by both men and women. Tasks deemed appropriate for one gender may be performed by either one. And these are very egalitarian societies. The division in labor is about getting things done. The more you divide up the task, the more you can do. It's not about men do this and females do that, and there's a very rigid split between the two. But that comes in as a segregated pattern. Almost all work is defined as masculine or feminine. Men and women rarely engage in joint efforts, and those considered the work that's considered feminine or for females or women's work, men should not do, and they will not do it without getting criticized for it if they're seen, and the same with females doing male work. Segregated pattern does come from very patriarchal societies most of the time. And the dual sex configuration. Each gender manages its own affairs, and the interests of both men and women are represented at all levels. So here you have the division of male-female, masculine-feminine, equal representation in the culture, and this is the dual sex configuration. The Tlingit in northwest coast North America, who've lived here for thousands of years, by the way. Gender relations are egalitarian. Males and females have equal status, equal say over their own bodies, equal say over their own identities. Women and men could achieve prestige through their own efforts. Sexual division of labor was not rigid, it was flexible. Women often acted as negotiators and handled the money for long-distance trade with the Tlingit. Why do females have lower status, receive less income, and are declined equal access in general when compared to men? How do you get an entire society to adopt this kind of inequality? People in control of creating, promoting cultural values for their own status. Here we have a very, again, in the United States, a very patriarchal society, established by the Western European patriarchy over 400 years ago, and as each group needed to be controlled for economic domination, each group was identified, given an identity. That identity was defined, their value was defined. That's where we get class, race, and gender stratified terms. It comes from the Western European patriarchy and is at the base of our global economy, capitalism. This is why we still have problems after 400 years. This is why after the advances of the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, we're still in the same place today. Why has this happened? It's caused by gender stratification. It is the way gender activities and attributes are differently valued. And so what, in our culture, or in a culture that's very patriarchal like ours, those things deemed masculine have more value in that society. Not because they actually do, but because people are taught to see those things that men do as more valuable than women. The interesting thing is, in matriarchal societies, you don't find that. I've talked about this before, but you find an equal distribution of value. And it's also related to the distribution of resources, as I pointed out. Resources that give prestige and power in a society. So the Western European patriarchy makes sure it can control the resources. And therefore, who has access? We often talk about capitalism bringing great technological advances. It does not. Human ingenuity brings technological advances. What capitalism does is determine what things will be developed and who will have access to them.